Hi, I'm Kate Kuzminski. I'm the Senior Fellow and Program Director of the Military Veterans and Society Program at CNAS. CNAS is committed to bold, innovative, bipartisan research that drives the national security policy forward. The Military Veterans and Society Program focuses our research on military personnel, veterans, and the civil-military divide. Our program explores how the military services can access, recruit, and retain the talent necessary to fight and win the nation's future wars. As part of our research, we examine the effect of policies, practices, and elements of service culture that enable or constrain the service's access to talent. We further explore how the services and DoD may draw from a talent pool that reflects the society from which it is drawn, particularly as there is a limited pool of qualified candidates for military service. A key part of our mission is to elevate underrepresented voices and perspectives of service members and veterans in order to provide perspective on the human element of our research. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us today for this virtual panel discussion to commemorate the 10th anniversary of the implementation of the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell on September 20th of this year. Today, we are proud to partner with the Athena Leadership Project, a research nonprofit examining how gender diverse teams and leaders shape national security. I'm pleased to introduce the co-founders of the Athena Leadership Project, Dr. Jeanette Gaudry-Haney and Dr. Kyle-Ann Hunter. Kai and Jeanette are also both CNAS Adjunct Senior Fellows. They'll be moderating today's discussion. A reminder that the views expressed during this event are those of the panelists and are not reflective of their position of their employers. I'll now turn over to Jeanette and Kai to introduce our panelists and get started.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you to everyone. Welcome to another Athena Leadership Project event in partnership with CNAS. It is October 2021, as we all know. 10 years ago last month, as Kate mentioned, the implementation of the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, the policy that had been in place for 17 years, was enacted, allowing gay, lesbian, and bisexual service members to serve openly. While the repeal of the policy was preceded by questions, concerns, and a lot of discussion about potential or projected impacts of this change on military unit cohesion and readiness by those opposed to the repeal, a decade removed, we can see that by and large, those concerns did not come to pass. And lesbian, gay, and bisexual service members have made significant positive impacts serving openly since September 2011. This is certainly cause for celebration since it speaks to the openness and growth of the service and indeed the United States as a whole. In November of 2010, 70% of service members surveyed believed that repealing Don't Ask, Don't Tell would have positive, mixed, or no impacts whatsoever on effectiveness. And public opinion against open service dropped from nearly half of those surveyed to just over a quarter. It also speaks to how enabling service members to live as their true selves supports and reinforces the professed values of the Department of Defense and military services. However, the world we live in today remains much less than it could be. A decade ago, 27% of the general public surveyed opposed the service of lesbian, gay, and bisexual personnel. National Coming Out Day was this past Monday, October 11th. And we still do not live in a world where coming out is safe for all. Biases against personnel of all kinds still exist, especially against LGBTQ+ personnel. And those stereotypes linger. While service members who are lesbian, gay, and bisexual can serve openly today, for decades they could not. Between the years before DADT was passed, when being lesbian, gay, or bisexual was cause for immediate removal from the service and often led to other than honorable discharges and the loss of benefits. Through years of having to serve while keeping the most human part of themselves secret, through today, when policies are removed, but both overt and unconscious biases linger. Living through this takes tolls and took tolls on individuals and on units as a whole.
And importantly, the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell only took us part of the way. While this repeal codified into law the ability of lesbian, gay, and bisexual service members to serve openly, Don't Ask, Don't Tell in its repeal neglected the service of transgender service members who have historically been excluded from discussions and policy changes. It wasn't until 2016 that the DoD published a policy that allowed transgender service members to serve and within a year to join the military. However, the last administration repealed this policy by tweet and then later implemented this change in 2019. The Biden administration reinstated this policy by executive order in 2021, just days after taking office. However, today, the service of transgender individuals is only protected by executive order and not codified into public law. In September, CNAS hosted a panel with former DoD and political leaders to discuss the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell and how it happened. It was a great panel, and we thought that what was also needed was a discussion of how these policies and their absence and the aftermath has directly shaped and impacted the lives of service members and veterans. 4 veterans have generally offered to join us today, have served in various capacities and roles, some before Don't Ask, Don't Tell, some during, and some after, and each have been impacted in very different ways. The mission of Athena Leadership Project is to explore how diverse leaders impact our national security and help leaders better understand how those they lead are affected by policies, stereotypes, and biases, and how their service and therefore their ultimate impact on military effectiveness can be limited by these. So understanding how service members and leaders of all kinds have been adversely impacted and the positive impacts they see or feel today because of their service is deeply important. We also want to address some of the limitations of our panel today. It is important to point out that while the stories and perspectives you'll hear today are incredibly diverse on a number of issues, they don't fully represent the range of experiences faced by service members and veterans. In addition to the stereotypes that accompany gender and sexuality, we also know that there are service members who battle racism, creating double binds in the discrimination they face. Additionally, we recognize that our discussion today is officer heavy, and that there may be underrepresenting a core group of individuals that are affected by this policy, as enlisted service members represent the majority of all service members and are impacted by different constraints on their service. We are fortunate that our panel is willing to engage with us on these gaps and talk about how we can better move forward. Now I'd like to introduce our panelists today. We'll provide a brief introduction, but want to ensure that they have the floor moving forward to tell us about themselves and their experience and perspectives. First up, we have Justin Johnson. Justin is a Marine Corps combat veteran who served as a logistics officer with operational deployments to Iraq, Japan, and Afghanistan. After leaving the Marine Corps, Justin earned a master's in international security and policy from Columbia and earned the Presidential Management Fellowship, serving in the DoD as a civilian. During his time in government, he held positions as an economic officer at the U.S. Embassy in London and in the political economic affairs at the U.S. embassies in Lithuania and for the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and as an analyst for U.S. Indo-PACOM on transnational threats. Since 2016, Justin has worked in the private sector investigating financial crimes for a range of organizations. Thank you, Justin, for joining us today. And next we have Sarah Klimm. Sarah is a Marine Corps veteran who retired as a gunnery sergeant after serving for 23 years in the Marine Corps. She participated in 10 named operations over 9 deployments and had a career highlight of serving in the Presidential Helicopter Squadron, HMX-1, which flies Marine One. Over her 2+ decades of service in before, during, and after Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and through the first woman being allowed to serve in combat roles. On the day of her retirement in 2016, it was announced that transgender individuals could openly serve. She experienced all of these inclusionary changes while having to remain silent about herself. Sarah identifies as a Marine, parent, wife, disabled veteran, lesbian, and transgender woman, in that order. Thank you for joining us today, Sarah.
Emily Miller is our next speaker, and Emily is an Army combat veteran, social entrepreneur, and LGBTQ advocate. She co-founded Rumi, an award-winning social enterprise that imports premium saffron and spices directly from conflict zones in Afghanistan. Side note, and this is a fun one, Rumi was featured on Shark Tank, and Emily was named one of the most innovative women in food and wine. Emily served as a captain in the U.S. Army on 1 deployment to Iraq and 2 deployments to Afghanistan, serving with the U.S. Special Operations Teams, where she was awarded the Combat Action Badge and Bronze Star Medal. She fought for the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell as the first LGBT active duty service member on the boards of Nights Out and was featured on HBO's The Strange History of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. She earned her Bachelor of Science from West Point and an MBA from Harvard Business School. And last but definitely not least, Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Barbara Wujciak is an optometrist, and I think I just butchered your last name, and I apologize.
You're just fine.
Okay, is an optometrist and Air Force reservist currently serving as Chief Optometrist of the 916th Aerospace Medicine Squadron at Seymour Johnson Air Force Base, North Carolina. Barb direct commissioned into the Air Force Reserve, serving not just as Chief Optometrist at the 916th, but also on active duty as an optometry element commander for the 316th Medical Squadron at Joint Base Anacostia Bowling. She provided care in DC for personnel across the DC area and served on humanitarian missions, providing eye care in underserved communities across the US and overseas. She was recognized as Reserve Guard Optometrist of the Year in 2020 and is an alum of the Naval Academy and a graduate of UNC Chapel Hill and the New England College of Optometry, along with multiple PME schools. So for all four of you, thank you so very much for being present today and for being willing to give us of your time generously and your experiences so that we can all be better leaders and build our organizations to be more inclusive organizations moving forward. We are going to launch first into some moderated questions. So really, we'd like to start with Justin, and basically we're going in alphabetical order right now. I'd really like to find out from each one of you if you can take a few minutes to speak about your service, when you served, in what capacity, and how you personally identify with the queer community.
Well, thank you all for joining this, and thanks for hosting and inviting me to be a part of it. So I guess where it started was in the late 90s. I was a young 18-year-old going into ROTC. I thought I would do it for a year. I thought I would also be the last person to go into the military from my family, come from a military background. My dad was in the Army, but I was more interested in theater, the arts, some sports, but clearly the stereotypical, a lot of people knew that I was gay before I did. So I identify as a gay man. At the time, I did not identify that way. And I think, like probably many people who go into military service, there is some conflict and tension at the heart of who we are, especially at that age. Young kids who are 18, 19, 20, making these decisions about what to do with their lives. And so I kind of joined because I love the camaraderie and esprit de corps. The conflict about my sexual orientation, really, even looking back 20 years ago, didn't really play a part in my decision to join. I loved the Marine Corps being the smallest force, an elite force, and one that, where I felt like I could get great opportunities to lead Marines. And this was before 2001. So, who knew what was going to happen? In any case, I was commissioned in 2001, went through all my training, was stationed in Okinawa for about 18 months. Then I went to Pendleton to be with 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines, where we deployed to Iraq, OIF-2, as they called it, from January until September of 2004. I was stationed in Ramadi, and the conflict there, and this is actually quite interesting, I think, the combat that we saw was quite intense. Our casualty rate was somewhere around a third, and about 35 Marines out of 1,000 died in about 7-month tour. So you can imagine with the intensity of that deployment, when you get back, there's kinds of a lot of issues going on. And I think in the months after I got back, that's when I made a decision that, I was actually gay, and that's who I was going to live my life as, because life was way too short to do otherwise. My EAS was coming up, and actually my decision to EAS was partly Don't Ask, Don't Tell. I was serving under that regime of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, but it was partly just because they wanted me to continue to deploy. And as many people know, at your 4-year mark, you usually get a B billet, time to go to a duty post or station. So in any case, I made the decision to EAS. Then I was involuntarily recalled in 2007, which, as many of you all know, I faced a conundrum because I was out to a lot of friends and family at that point, father, mother, everyone else, but I was not out to the Marines. So I was brought to Kansas City, given orders to go to Afghanistan, and I had a decision to make. And I asked a lot of my combat Marine buddies, what would you do? What do I do? I didn't have a family at the time. I didn't have a spouse. And to a man, the ones that I consulted, despite their views on homosexuality or the conservatism of their political beliefs, they all said, you should serve, you should go, you've been called, you made this commitment, you should do it. And I think that just brought home to me the stupidity of this policy, where everybody else was saying, do this honorable service, because it really is a conundrum. Do I, come out or not? But clearly the decision was right to go and be, deploy and do what I had committed and signed up to do. So I went to Afghanistan. Things were quite quiet compared to the Iraq deployment. Then I got back and I got out and time went on. But that's kind of my evolution over time. And that's me. Sorry to go on a little bit too long. Thanks.
No, that was perfect. And I think you point out very clearly the contradiction that existed in the policy. And so thank you for that. And thank you for going back for your service in general. Yeah, from all of us. Sarah, I'd like to pose the same question to you as well. Can you talk a bit about the capacity in which you served and how you identify now?
So I joined in 1992, and that was prior to Don't Ask, Don't Tell. In fact, I can remember on the contract where it specifically asked under a section, I think it was titled Character and Social Adjustment. And it said, are you homosexual, or are you homosexual or bisexual? And they even gave the definitions of what that meant. For me at the time, I didn't even know who I was. My identity was what I was being told it should be. Male growing up, and I grew up in Southern Pennsylvania, complete farm country. So really no references for me to work on figuring myself out. So, to me, and I didn't lie when I signed that, later on through service, I retired in 2016. So that long length of service, I saw the Don't Ask, Don't Tell repeal. I've seen women allowed in aviation roles. I've seen all these different inclusive changes. And one of the things that I've noticed with all of them, it was always the same excuses. Every time they say, we can't do this, it won't work, we've proven them wrong. So for me as a transgender woman in hiding the whole time, it just kept giving me hope all the way through. And like Justin said, there's conundrums that come out. My biggest conundrum that I had through that service and period was, here I am a leader. I am not technically allowed to serve. And how do I, if somebody, one of my Marines comes out to me in any capacity prior to Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and then after comes out to me, how do I handle that? Knowing who I am, but I can't tell anybody at the same time. So it creates a major leadership conundrum, because first and foremost, we all know LGBTQ plus service members have served even since the time of the Civil War. It's just, so it creates these conundrums in leadership. It creates there's biases out there that keep going through. So long period of time that I was in, started as a helicopter mechanic, ended up as a maintenance production control chief for a helicopter squadron, spent 7 years in that billet. And as was said in my bio, I identify as a transgender woman and lesbian.
Thank you for that. And I know we talked about this on the phone. Can you remind me which years you were at HMX?
So I was at HMX 2004 to 2008.
Okay, I think you just missed a good friend of mine, but that had to be quite the experience while you were going through what you were.
I will say about that experience, the scary part was the background check, the security clearance. I was by named to go there, and I was worried that somebody might find something out and figure out that I was transgender through my security clearance process.
Wow. Yeah, and having to live with that while you were there, no doubt as well. Thank you for that. And Emily, I'd like to ask the same question of you.
Yeah, so I actually joined, I went to West Point in the summer of 2004. So that's really, when my journey began, putting the uniform on. Like the other panelists, I was 18 years old. I had no idea that I was gay at the time. I wasn't out to myself. Probably like Justin, everyone in the room knew I was gay except me. But at the time I had no idea. I grew up in Southern Indiana. This was, post 9/11. And I felt very strongly that I wanted to serve. I wanted to get a great education. I wanted to become an officer, but had no idea, I didn't understand, what Don't Ask, Don't Tell was at the time. I think I was pretty oblivious to the policy itself. And obviously not being out, I had no idea what ramifications it would have for me serving. So I went to West Point. I would also say growing up in Southern Indiana, I didn't experience overt homophobia, but I will say I didn't know a single out gay person in my life, not a single one. And so it was just something that was not spoken of. There was no real representation. And, I always tell people I showed up at West Point, and that was the first time I met other gay men and women, ironically was at West Point. So in my sophomore year at West Point, I actually came out to a close group of my really close friends and my family, and found that they were super supportive. But I had a real choice to make, because by the end of your sophomore year, right before your junior year, is when you sign on the dotted line, so to speak, right? You're on the hook for your education. You owe the U.S. government 5 years of active service, 3 years of inactive ready reserves. And I knew that there were serious consequences for signing on the line. I knew folks at West Point who had been dishonorably discharged, who owed in excess of $300,000 to the academy for their education, which is a life-changing consequence. But I decided, I was largely undeterred to serve. I knew that it was going to put me, in a tough spot, but I felt very strongly about serving. And so went on, graduated from West Point in 2008, and commissioned as an engineer officer, and went to Iraq almost immediately. It was one of the first members of my class to deploy to Iraq. A fairly quiet deployment. This was in 2009, when we were pretty much drawing down from Iraq, and then went to Afghanistan a couple of years later with a special ops team, and that was not; those are not quiet deployments. Those were very high op tempo deployments, and then was able to decided to leave the service in 2013. But I would say the arc of my career was fascinating in the sense that lived don't ask, don't tell, under that policy, obviously fought for the repeal of the policy, and then actually got to witness it rolled back, which was, I think, a really tremendous thing to just, be there for that full arc, so to speak. So that's kind of the high level, and just excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Emily. And last to Barb, please, same question.
Well, I kind of have two stories. In 1980, I entered the Naval Academy in the 5th class of women, something that's one of my most proud moments. And I knew nothing about myself and sexuality, but I played softball. And that's a big clue to most people that things are going to change. I started a relationship with a woman, and actually, my roommates rummaged through my letters, because we had to write letters back in the day, and turn them in. And I was subsequently put on trial. And then we had my resignation letter written for me after the trial was over. So came back home. This is the end. This is the middle of our youngster year, which is the sophomore year. And then I, finished up college in North Carolina, and kind of went about my business and became an optometrist and opened a practice and everything. And then was, fast forward many years, became involved with the Service Members Legal Defense Network. And everybody says, oh, you have such a great story about getting kicked out and everything. So lobbied Congress and actually ended up on the board of SLDN for the last couple of years. And when you have that kind of front row seat as to what's going on in Washington, I'm like, wow, I wonder, I knew it was going to be repealed, I just didn't know when. And then I started thinking, like, can I ever get my commission back? And I told my crazy story to a couple of friends, and they're like, sure, go for it. And I'm like, well, so the other thing is I was 48 years old at the time. And so that's an old officer in any book. But I called the Navy and I said, hey, do you have any positions for reserve optometrists? And they said, no, we get them all off of active duty. I'm like, okay. And I was talking to a friend of mine who's an Air Force reservist, and she says, well, there are different branches of service. And I'm like, really? So called the Air Force recruiter, the health professions recruiter called me back and said, I've been looking for an optometrist. And as it turns out, there was an opening here for over a year and a half. They had no eye care. And so I was, at the right place at the right time. And I got commissioned as a major. And 28 years after I left the Naval Academy, I always say I've had the largest promotion of anybody in the military. I go from a midshipman 3rd class to a major. So, and then for the last almost 12 years, I enjoyed just a terrific career in the reserves, and got a chance to do active duty for 3 years up in DC, past couple of years. So this has been great now. I remember my first commander I came out to just as Don't Ask, Don't Tell was being repealed. And he's a hospitalist. He's not a psychologist, but he said, Barb, it's time to quit compartmentalizing your life. And this has been just terrific, kind of completing the circle.
Thank you for that, Barb. And I'll turn it over to Kai now.
All right, thank you. Excuse me, thank you so much for all of this. And we're going to go in reverse order now. So Barb, you get to be first for this one. So, as you talked about your service, there was a lot of discussion of awareness of policies that had existed, whether it was nothing, right? That it was completely forbidden to serve, or Don't Ask, Don't Tell existing, or the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. But I want to shift away from policies to start thinking about biases or differential treatment, whether that's, and I think we often use the word maltreatment, but I really want to focus differential treatment, because I think that's probably describes it a little bit better and a little bit more accurately. So want to discuss one, were you aware of any biases or treatments, even if you weren't out and were not to yourself, among or against the LGBTQ community? And how did that make you feel about service, and how did that change sort of throughout the time that you served? Did you become more aware? Did you see things sort of change around these biases, and really think about how it impacted your growth and development? So Barb, let's start with you first.
Interesting. I'm going to go back to the Naval Academy days in the 1980s, and I actually got along. I mean, this was back in the day, they only allowed 100 women per class. So we were definitely a minority, a very small minority. And everybody lives in the same dorm. And I seemed to get along very well with the guys. And I could see where my roommates who were straight were more maybe flirtatious with them, and they didn't take them quite as seriously. I scored points because I played varsity softball and, did well academically and stuff like that for our whole company. So in that respect, maybe I was treated differently, but certainly not as a lesbian. And then since then,
I think that's also.
And then since then,
go ahead. Sorry.
Since then, I haven't had any sort of biases towards me. I come in, I do my job. I'm not a lesbian optometrist. I'm an optometrist. There's no difference.
That's wonderful. Emily, same question for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think, looking at my time, both at West Point and in the Army, I think biases definitely existed, right? I think back on the things that I just kind of put up with and just pushed down and tried to ignore. But, everything from, homophobic slurs were pretty commonplace. I think anybody would tell you, won't say those words, but they were thrown around quite liberally. I mean, heck, we even had marching cadences that were directed at LGBT people. The infamous "quote unquote" pink beret, is the denigrated beret in the services, meant to make fun of homosexual people. And I even had, I think back about my time at West Point, I had even a law professor dedicate an entire class to, why Don't Ask, Don't Tell was such a fantastic policy, and why ensuring that lesbian and gay cadets and officers couldn't serve was a great policy. I remember just fuming, when I left that class. So I think they definitely existed. I think homophobia was alive and well through a long part of my service, just kind of baked into the culture, so to speak. But it wasn't all negative. I think to Barb's point, I also had really wonderful experiences. I think West Point gave me this really strange opportunity where, for the first time in my life, I had kind of a robust network of other lesbian and gay cadets. We called ourselves the family. You know, we were kind of an underground network. And to be clear, we did live double lives. And I think, you know, that part of it was certainly not healthy, but, you know, I think it wasn't all doom and gloom. You know, it obviously wasn't a good policy for the military, but, you know, there were some bright spots in there. So, you know, I can't say that it was all terrible, but, you know, it was definitely not easy on a day-to-day basis, hearing the things you would hear.
Thanks. You know, and I think it shows so much how our language and culture intertwine. And I know that's something that, you know, Jeanette and I have both talked about quite a bit. So sort of seeing that live out in your life is really important. Sarah, let's hear from you next.
Wow, biases. They're all there. They're for everything, not just LGBTQ. It's just when you look at the military and you think of it, you know, it's very hyper masculine, and like you've heard in the past, you know, the locker room talk, all that stuff. It's always there. But one of the things I found with some of the biases, they were just words, and the people really didn't believe it. They would say those things just to sound cool or to say it, especially through the junior enlisted ranks. You know, it was people would say things to fit in. If somebody else said it, they're going to agree with it. It's a peer pressure thing. But I mean, I've heard them all, you know, from being gay is a sin. Gay men are equal to women, and neither can do the job of a real man. I mean, they're going to exist. They exist I always look at it this way. If something exists in the general public, in general society, it's going to exist in the military. And, you know, it's because that's where you get your candidates from, you know, is general society. So, but I've heard them all. But one thing I will say about biases, they change. It's, you know, military has a high turnover rate, has a high attrition. We're getting rid of the older mindsets, bringing in newer mindsets, and it's constantly happening. And I watched it over my entire time in. And for me, it gave me hope. Like I'll say one of the best things I ever saw was after the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell was the first Marine Corps ball we went to. I was looking forward to it because I knew some of my Marines and other Marines within my unit were bringing their partners that they were never allowed to show before. And I wanted to see that joy and happiness. And I will say this, that ball was amazing. The command was amazing. Everybody was amazing. It surprised me. More people I never thought would be excited for it were. Some of my peers, some of those old crusty gunnies, they were like awesome. And that really brought me hope, you know, even knowing that I still wasn't allowed to openly serve. It was great seeing other people being able to.
Yeah, the change in mindset, I think, is something that, you know, as Jeanette alluded to at the beginning, has been a big positive coming out of this. Justin, how about you? How experiences with biases shaped your feelings about service?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I kind of hear the other panelists speaking about this, and I hear echoes of my experience, obviously. You know, I think it's kind of interesting. I lived a bifurcated life in a way, and not in the way that we all think of necessarily. But when I was in gay bars and clubs in my first period of service, and then after, you know, I was viewed as passable for a heterosexual male. But in the Marines, I don't know if my fellow officers were a little bit more intuitive, at least for coming from university ROTC straight to the basic school, which all Marines know is 6 months. There was some idea that I might not be, totally straight. And it was odd. Like, I have distinct memories. Forget what the course is, Kai, you probably remember. It's like the 6 mile where we're wearing the little canteens and all that and doing all the obstacle course. It's 60 minutes or something. I did it in something like 58. I think the minimum for males was 70. And, you know, I think some of the guys who were quite a bit more conservative were really thrown aback by that. You know, like, oh, how's this guy? You know, I think I didn't even hear this, but one of my best friends from the Marines said that they were conversation, you know, without me in mind, and said, you know, oh, what did you get? What did you get? And then they said, oh, Johnson got 58. And one of the other guys said, oh, that's because he works out all the time. It's like, okay, great. I'm glad that you can like try to denigrate that because what, I'm gay. So, you know, you heard stuff like that. And one guy actually randomly, and this is another story at TBS, we're in these barracks where the one time in your life where officers really are like barracked together with like 4 roommates. It was me on a Sunday or a Saturday night, and I happened to be in the barracks, and this guy kind of was making a move, but I was like, this is not making a move. And it was really weird. I'm just thinking, this guy is not making a move. It's very clearly like an effort to I don't know, out me or something. So saw those things happen. I think the officer enlisted dynamic is different as well, where the officers, I think, at least the Marines I served with, were a little bit more, you know, college educated. So there's already a distinction there about the biases and how they're expressed. You would hear jokes and things like that about officers, obviously, but I think as far as like hostile homophobic comments, I didn't hear that a lot from fellow officers. That just didn't come up a lot. And so I think that's partly a function of education, perhaps. But, you know, you heard some of those things. I think it's interesting. My service when I was in Afghanistan recalled, it was kind of liberating actually, because I was recalled from civilian world and I had a job to go back to because of USERA. And, you know, I had a kind of, you know, IDGAF attitude, which was, you know, I was going to do my service. I was going to do the hours. I was going to fly around Afghanistan being the procurement officer for the ANP. But, you know, if you tried to come at me with something, it would just be like, what are you going to do? Send me back to my job in America? Like, give me a break. And it wasn't I'm going to shirk my duty or anything. It was more of just about the being gay. So, you know, that was kind of, you know, really, really interesting. So, I mean, I didn't face outright homophobia. I mean, some of those things, obviously, those are a bit homophobic, but, you know, I had a very big, strong attitude. I have a pretty strong personality. So I think it was a little difficult to kind of pigeonhole me as someone who's going to be a shrinking violet and that you could just say whatever you wanted to without a consequence. So anyway.
Actually, you mind if I do a follow-up on that for a second? Just because it's such a fascinating line of discussion to think about how the services are gendered and how masculinity, femininity, you've got an other, you've got a main. I'd love to hear, Sarah, do you have any thoughts or anything you want to contribute on this? Because Justin mentioned the officer enlisted divide and what it might be like. I'd love to hear your perspective if you're willing.
I would say on the enlisted side, I think you did get more toxic comments than you did on the officer side. It being where at the point of gunny in an aviation unit with so many officers, I got to interact with them a lot, and you hear how they would be talking about certain subjects, and you would hear them sometimes make the comments, you know, against LGBTQ people. And there was a difference. I mean, they were still toxic each, but on the enlisted side, it was definitely a little bit more descriptive type toxicity, and really like diving in. One of the other things I noticed on the enlisted side too is the underground. It's weird. There is an underground between the ranks on the enlisted side. And as a leader, I learned you got to tap into those to know what's going on behind the scenes. And because it's not in view. And nowadays it's on Facebook. You can find it in certain groups on Facebook. It's still all there. It's kind of a little bit more underground and maybe not so maybe violent associated or violence associated as it had been in the past. Like when they were repealing Don't Ask, Don't Tell, or when they created Don't Ask, Don't Tell, I remember some of the very senior enlisted going, gays should be killed. You know, that was the mindset then. And we're talking people that joined in the 70s are now getting ready to retire, and Don't Ask, Don't Tell is coming along as a policy. And it's like, don't let no gays in my military. They all should be killed. That's definitely changed now.
It's thank you for that. And I remember hearing some of that. Kai and I both obviously come from the wing as well, which has its own set of problems, but it's interesting. Kai and I were just having a text exchange about like follow-ups on this, because this has us thinking of so many more different questions for you all. But I want to, before we get too far down different roads, you know, you've each talked a little bit about how the career the culture and your career was impacted by your identity in the middle of living through these cultural changes. Can Can you talk a little bit about each of you, how your experiences informed the way you led and thought about leadership? If it did, what those impacts were, and how it maybe impacted the way you saw the world as a leader at that point. And as far as order, we can do our front to back again, just starting with Justin again, if you don't mind me putting you on the spot like that.
Sorry, Jeanette, so you're saying how our experience being gay affected our leadership style? Is that kind of the...
How your experience, not just your identity, but how the identity interacted with the culture and some of the experiences you had as a result of that?
Right, yeah. So, I mean, I think, you know, the interactions with the culture, it clearly, you know, I showed up, as I said, and you know, there's a transition from 17, 18 to 21, 22 as a new commissioned officer. You know, I think the culture had an impact. I mean, I look back on my service in the military, and I think outside of just the identity as being a gay man, having served under Don't Ask, Don't Tell, I think it's you know, the benefits of having served, and I think most of us on this can appreciate things around discipline, order and discipline, the way that it kind of structures our lives and enabled us to go forward to have really challenging leadership and management issues and stressful situations. So I think all of us who've served can appreciate that just in general. I think as far as my identity and how it went, interestingly enough, over time, as I got more comfortable and came out to myself in the time I served from 2001 to 5, and then in the recall, obviously, as far as my appearance and my presentation, you know, I'm not sure if it was a cause, but I kind of moved towards a more masculine presentation. And I'm not sure if that was a result, you know, I haven't interrogated it a lot, if that was a result of the culture that I was around and the, you know, emphasis on fitting in. But I think it did certainly influence the way that I presented myself. But, you know, again, disentangling the, you know, good order and discipline and stiff upper lip of the military from, you know, flamboyant displays of my sexuality, which I only say with love because I definitely have them. You know, disentangling which was what in the chicken or the egg, I think is a challenge. But, you know, as far as the way that I presented it, definitely influenced it. I do think the leadership question is quite interesting, but I'll wait to answer that part later.
No, you can answer now if you want to. It's really, yeah, and how it maybe impacted that in your civilian career as well, if it did.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think what I loved, you know, what I think it allowed me to do, and I was having a little bit of a direct message with Kai about the enlisted side versus the officer side and that underground network that was mentioned as well by Sarah. You know, the fraternization rules were such that for officers, in some ways it was more difficult to be an officer and be gay, or, you know, LGBTQ. In some ways, I think it was more difficult for the enlisted. One way it was easier is there's so much visibility for officers, where it's like that officer, especially with the Marines, it's, I think, 13 or 14 to 1. So you've got 14 enlisted guys and women, men and women for one officer. So I think that created some challenges, fraternization being one where you would find people that you would like and you would be friendly with and be able to talk about all these things with. In Okinawa, distinctly, I remember, and San Diego as well, where you're able to have these conversations, but you've got to put boundaries around the relationship because of your service in the military, where you can't necessarily have the fraternization question. And I think as far as relating to people, I think being a member of a minority, and a distinct one at that, and especially being raised, you know, 79 to, you know, born in 1979, Mississippi, North Carolina, Southern family, military family, I think it gives you an insight into other identities that are a minority community as well, where you're able to relate a little bit better than I would have if I had not been a member of distinct minority, and where you're able to kind of relate to what they're going through and maybe create, you know, possible solutions or ways to handle it based on the experiences that you're having. Of course, masking all of that because of DADT and not wanting to reveal to them why you're kind of empathizing quite well or whatever it may be with this individual. And then as far as the civilian sector, obviously the military host of tools has come into play. And it's more of the opposite, where being gay is so, you know, being a gay male now in 2021 in a large corporation in the United States or in Britain where I used to work is beyond not an issue. I mean, it's beyond that. I will say that I had an interesting conversation, which I think is the Presidential Management Fellow, which I think many of you know about, where you do a 2-year rotation. This was right after I went to Colombia and after I deployed to Afghanistan. One of the panelists on the panel, and I knew this because I knew somebody else on the panel who is now a good friend of mine, she put me point blank on the spot about the Afghanistan recall and almost saying, so you were dishonest when you went back into Afghanistan, on the spot. And it wasn't a let's challenge this and like see how this goes. Found out after the fact that she did not want me to be chosen as a PMF because things were really difficult right now in DoD and we don't necessarily need this. And this was 2010. So, I think there are still attitudes that sometimes linger. And, most people hear the story I talked about with Afghanistan and think, wow, okay, interesting conundrum, right choice, wrong choice, whatever, not really a choice. But that was one attitude that I encountered after the fact. It just came to mind because I was talking to my friend about this 2 nights ago. So interesting.
Yeah, and that was only in 2010. That's demoralizing. Yeah, okay. Thank you for that. Sarah, I'm going to turn to you with the same question about leadership. Oh, you're still muted.
Sorry about that. The first part of the question, you asked about how was your career impacted by your identity? For me, I think it was just the opposite. My identity was impacted by my career. And so I think that makes it a little bit nuanced for me on that side. When I didn't know myself, my identity, when I went in, I got exposed to the bigger world, started to find references of myself, or what could be myself, but then they were all, they were references to like prostitutes and mentally ill people and all that. So I really kind of used the service and the career in the service to keep that box around me and protect me, but I had to hide the whole time doing it. As far as becoming a leader, in a way, it really did help me. I kind of got to navigate between 2 worlds in the military. I passed as a straight white male. I was married to a woman. I was able to navigate it. And I think it gave me some advantages that I could look at things from a different perspective, knowing that I was actually a transgender woman the whole time. And I used that a lot in my leadership, trying to get rid of biases and stereotypes. You're sitting there in your little gunny peer group talking and somebody says something and then you're like, no, that's kind of not right. But all the time I had to be careful that I didn't reveal too much about myself because I had a family and the Marine Corps was my career. If too much was found out about me, I lost my job. So, but all along the way, even like with women being allowed in, was fighting those biases. I heard them about, oh, they're going to get pregnant all the time and never be here at work, stuff like that, and combating. I'm like, no, there's a policy behind all this. Here, read it. This is how it works. So I was able to keep doing that. And I think that made me a better leader.
Yeah, it's funny. So the whole thing about pregnant Marines, that's what drove me 16 years ago to start investigating. So, I mean, it had to happen to me for me to start getting curious, right? Which is kind of sad, but yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Emily, same question for you, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, the eye-opening experience was when I first deployed to Iraq. When we talk about leadership, I reflect on that time, and I showed up in country, a brand new second lieutenant, 22 years old, and I had a platoon. I was given a platoon that had already been in country for 9 months. They were almost all male combat engineers. I only had 1 woman in my platoon. And it was just an isolating and lonely experience, I think, as a gay person, but also as a woman. Leadership of basically an all-male unit. We were at a remote outpost. I think for the first time, I was stripped of my kind of like network and support system that I had when I was a cadet at West Point. And so I was, really, really difficult. It was like our emails and our phone calls were being screened for operational security. So I felt like, man, even the people I would want to talk to over the phone or at home, I really couldn't. We were always mindful of like the pronoun game and being super careful. I think, that deployment really changed me. I came home from that deployment angry about the policy, right? And I remember thinking, I've got to channel this frustration and anger into something useful. And that's really what led me down the path of summer of 2009, I had heard through the grapevine that there was a group of LGBT West Point alumni that started a group called Nights Out. And I said, this is it. I've got to volunteer. I've got to do something behind the scenes to move the needle on this, because, you know, I don't want anybody to experience the kind of loneliness that I experienced on that deployment. Leadership is lonely enough as it is, but I think especially when you're a minority, you know, as a woman or a gay person in the military, I mean, and God knows for people of color as well, you know, it's just, so I started volunteering, and I think, you know, I joined the board of Nights Out. I started advocating behind the scenes. I started speaking on NPR anonymously. I started writing in the New York Times anonymously, did the HBO documentary. So really, and I think for me, it was, I want the American people to know that LGBT people like me are serving in combat, putting our lives on the line, serving our country. We're here, you know, we're already here. And so I think for me, that advocacy was really important. And then, you know, talking about leadership, I think it really helped me evolve my leadership style over time. I look back on that first deployment, you know, I passed as straight. I had long blonde hair. Nobody would have known otherwise, you know, and I think as time went on, you know, I cut my hair, I changed my appearance. I really thought, you know, authenticity and bringing my full self to work, it's really important, you know, to build these relationships. People need to know who I am. You know, I don't want to have a double life. I want to be a whole person. You know, I don't want to compartmentalize anymore. And I think that really shaped my leadership style to focus on, you know, we'll talk about this later. I have some ideas for our policy leaders, but, you know, how do you really build inclusive teams, and how do you foster inclusive leadership? And I think for me, that's how this policy kind of shaped my own leadership style over time.
Thank you. And we will definitely, that's one of our big closing questions where we really want to get at, you know, your inputs on policy and how to make things more inclusive for us all as leaders going forward. Thank you. And Barb, again, we come to you towards the end for your turn, please.
Well, how did it impact my career? Well, I lost my scholarship and lost my career in the Navy. That was just, it's, you know, can't go back and do that again. So I had to start all over again. Kind of rebuilding from ground zero, you know. So I went to the Naval Academy because I'm a science nerd and I wanted to do science research with the Navy. Yeah, of course that didn't happen. I ended up in the other nerd career as an optometrist. But in my career in the Air Force, like I said, starting in 2009, I did a lecture one time to my squadron, the medical squadron, when it's about 80 people. And I learned in public health school this values exercise where it's this thing, the self-discovery thing, and you kind of zero in on what your value is. And mine was, it turned out to be integrity. And I remember I went back to my optometry office with my 3 technicians and I said, you know, I know my value is integrity and I just haven't been 100% honest with you. So I came out to them and told them a little bit of my story. And I had a master sergeant, a senior airman, and a staff sergeant, a male staff sergeant, the other 2 were gals. And the senior airman said, well, I remember I was in language school at the time, and this one guy got kicked out and just kind of told his story. And then the master sergeant says, well, you know, I really respect you, ma'am, blah, blah, blah. And the guy was just, he was just really quiet, just really, really quiet. And I just didn't know him. I mean, he was married, had 3 kids, and couldn't get a good read on him. Well, I got a text after I got home, and it was the most genuine text that I have ever received. It was like, I can't believe that you kept this all inside. You know, I respect you. I am proud to serve under you. And that's how things had changed. So I think getting back to what Emily said about authenticity, I think that's the biggest thing. If you are authentic, then people will respect that no matter what that is.
I love the story about the text. That those are the kind of things that stick with you. And I'm glad you received it. I'm glad you were in a position to have that conversation with them. I think it's a thank you. Thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
Let me turn it over to Kai now for the next one.
All right. So we're going to merge some of our pre-planned questions here to really pick up on some themes that you're all really highlighting, which is around stereotypes that exist in a variety of different ways. And I think you've all mentioned things, whether, you know, as Barb, they're like, well, I played softball and got around along with the guys better, right? You know, very much a stereotype of sort of where men and women sit. You know, I think Justin, I chuckle a little bit when like they try to degrade working out at the basic school, because that's all like anybody does anyway in the Marine Corps, right? And like you, especially in like their nice little silkies that are there, right? With this sense that like, oh, you know, gay man, of course, just cares about being in the gym on his appearance there. I think, you know, Emily, some of what you're talking about, just presentation, right? The ideal of like the long blonde hair. I think particularly when we were looking at Iraq, Afghanistan deployments that very juxtapose like Western ideas of femininity with what we were seeing there. And Sarah, your discussions on, you know, being able to just pass as a straight white man and be sort of one of the guys, right? And it just slips in based on how you look. And I'll say particularly like as a gunny, right? Very easy to be, you know, white looking straight male, right? That's an easy thing to sort of fit into here, right? So want to talk a little bit about your experiences with, you know, that dynamic, right? Sort of what this ideal type of a military person is, how it intersects with some of our notions of gender, how it could have worked, you know, advantage, disadvantage there. But then, you know, think about how your potential like rank or position might have either helped you with it, how you've seen it be different. I hope this question makes sense, you know, but we've got this very much military ideal type that's there, right? That is also very much linked to gender ideal types that we have. And I think even for when we talk about military women, there's a very ideal type of what we think of even there. So how did some of those ideal types fit into your experiences? And how have you seen them change? You know, when we look at like how we're actually growing and changing about what the ideal type might look like. And if there's anyone who really wants to go first on this one, we can jump in, or I will call on people too to sort of mix up the order here. Okay, Emily, I'm going to put you on the top spot first, because your comment about your long blonde hair got me really, really thinking about this idea.
Yeah, I mean, it's something I've thought a lot about. You know, that there is a lot of privilege too. I mean, look, I'm a white woman and I had the ability to pass as straight for a very long time, right? And so there's also real privilege there, right? Especially when we talk about other minorities like people of color, right, who experience racism in pretty extreme ways sometimes. So I'm also cognizant of like, yeah, you know, I think for a long time I passed as a straight woman. It was really interesting. My soldiers, a lot of them had never met a gay person, right? And so, you know, I was a platoon leader and an executive officer in the same unit. And these guys had known me as, you know, Lieutenant and then Captain Miller, right? And when I came out, it was, you know, that's one thing that you know, being LGBT is interesting, right? Where these guys now knew me on a personal level. You know, they knew me as a leader. They respected me. They knew that I was competent and good at my job. And what I find is that, you know, prejudice is really tough to uphold when you know somebody, you know? And I think that was another really fascinating thing, was like when I did finally come out, they were like, wow, like I support you. We love you. I don't know a lesbian besides you, but we, you know, we support you. So that was a really interesting experience as well. I think especially when we talk about, you know, stereotypes and intersectionality. I mean, look, I think also being a woman, I've talked about this, but being a woman and being LGBT is definitely a double bind. Like it confers some advantages, right? Like to Barb's earlier point about, I definitely fit in with the guys more. I definitely ascribe to more of the masculine stereotypes. And so in that way, you know, it was easier for me to kind of fit into the hyper masculine military culture. But then of course, in other ways, like it wasn't. I think when we talk about, you know, the stereotypes about women and about gay people, I felt were very similar, right? We were different, we were weak, we were going to change this special culture that existed. You know, we were going to disrupt good morale and discipline. You know, we were going to do all these terrible things. You know, the same things were said about women and LGBT. And it was so interesting because I ultimately, when I went to Afghanistan, I was one of the first women to serve with SEALs, Delta Force, and 75th Ranger Regiment on night raids, right? And so that was the first time where, people just did not want women in these all-male units, but we proved, night after night that we could do the exact same things the men, we could carry the same weight, we could do the same missions. And I think, we've just kind of learned these lessons over and over again, whether it's from the point of view of a woman, from the point of view of an LGBT service member. So yeah, I hope that answers the question, but that's just a little bit about my experience there.
It absolutely does. And Sarah, I saw you unmute as you wanted to say something, so you get to go next.
I like to back up what Emily said. There's coming out is an amazing thing, an amazing experience. For a lot of us, it's a buildup of all these irrational fears that you have about coming out, like losing family, losing friends. And in being in the military, you create a giant network of friends and associates and acquaintances that you have, and they're all from different cultures, ideas, and all that. So you don't know when you come out where it's going to go, who you're going to lose. And it's like for me when I came out, way I look at it is I only lost 2 people on my social media, and a few hundred in my Facebook, and it's mostly Marines and Marine brethren, from junior troops to peers to commanders. I only lost 2 people, and they were people I went to high school with. Had nothing to do with the Marine Corps. I got statements from quite a few of them that they wish they could have known that about me earlier so they could have supported me. And I think when we look at it, and that story right there is that something that our policymakers and decision makers need to hear. The support already exists. It's already there. People are going to support. Yes, you're going to have the stereotypes. And the problem is the stereotypes and the biases, they are the ones with a louder voice. We need to elevate the voices of support there. So really, I think that backing up what Emily said about coming out and being some of the first one, or for me, the first transgender woman that they've ever known. And I've had some very personal, them asking personal questions and trying to figure out and understand. Some of them don't necessarily agree with my, like they call, lifestyle choice, but they still love me as a Marine, and they would still support me and go to battle for me. So it's a great bond that you have in the military. And I think that's something that we need to be elevated more and discussed and thought about in policy making, is not the voice of the one that is coming from a bias or a stereotype, but the voices of support that are there. Look for those. Because they're the ones that are going to win out in the end anyway, because as we have proven it every single time through integration of Black service members in the 60s, through gay, LGBTQ being allowed, through women, all the way from basically any MOS now. Every time that we get in there that they said we couldn't do it, we've done it. And we prove them. We prove them wrong every time. And it's sad that we got to continue to do it that way, but it works. And so that's why it's like back in, and it's surprising when you come out how many people back you up. There you go.
No, and it's good to hear the positive stories too, right? I think even one thing that you said that I think is important to sort of hammer home, that even, if there's this sense of like, I don't quite understand, what it is, but I've built a bond with you. And it is, I think to Emily's point, it's so much harder to hold prejudices once you know someone, right? And I think, that's across so many identities, we see that true, and like why often the military can be a leader, right? Because you build those bonds and formations, and it's hard to. Barb, I want to turn to you next on this one. And particularly if you've seen anything different, from your days as a midshipman, but now, being in leadership roles around how, your airmen or other doctors really act engaged, if there's been any sort of big changes, or if a lot of it's still the same.
Well, the biggest change is I just started a new job as a civilian on an Air Force base. And so, when you get to a new place, they give you the little scavenger hunt thing, and you got to have everybody sign off. And I was talking to who will turn out to be my direct supervisor. And she's a lieutenant colonel flight doc. And but she sits in the big office now. She doesn't see patients. And so we're chatting about, her expectations, blah, 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 blah. And then she said, oh, and my wife and I was like, what? And I'm like, wow, now that you said that, let me tell you a little story too. So it's just like, wow, this is actually happening. This happened. And it's like, she felt, I don't know, maybe she got some vibe from me that it was okay to come out to me. But just the fact that she did that was just terrific.
Yeah, I mean, the comfort with that and the normalization is also so important, I think, to hear. Justin, I'm going to turn to you, Nick, sort of on how identities, biases played out for you, and as well, I think would be interesting to talk about Marine and civilian life, where you are now too.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll echo exactly what was said by everyone else. I mean, the fact that a bunch of Marines who served with me said, go and serve, and this is not going to be a problem, I think is, indicative of that exact situation where we serve together. There's a strong bond, especially through combat, that made a lot of these other considerations concerning. And I think one thing, just this is my maybe getting onto the leader's recommendation a little bit is, and I think all of us have probably had this from hearing everyone speak, Sarah and Emily, and that we, when you come, you come out to someone, whether it's your parents and family or whether it's your fellow Marines, it's a beautiful process, as Sarah said. It's, living honestly for the first time in your life, and that's a process for you as well, fully embracing who you are. Seeing their development and what changes over time, and how they interact with you and what they're comfortable with is quite beautiful, honestly. They can ask questions of you that some might consider insensitive, but really, I think, opportunity for them to grow as well and to see that. And I think having a lot of grace around this point is great. And they have grace for me and I have grace for them. And that maybe you don't have necessarily the best reaction at first, but over time that changes. Like, I don't want to hear about it. And then all of a sudden they're asking you for relationship advice. So I think these, as far as that goes, I think a lot of grace and tolerance around your experience with, coming out is probably really useful, at least in my instance. And as far as the civilian world, as I said, I had that one interesting experience with that PMF person who was interviewing me, and, I'm going to make a joke, which is not intended to really be that hard, but, for crying out loud, she was at ATNL as a civilian and never served in the military. So I think it was a bit rich for her to say that, but in any case, so that was one experience that I had. But as far as outright hostility, it's almost, and I think I'm kind of lucky or blessed or something like that. It's very difficult for, I think, especially a lot of masculine heterosexual men who are heteronormative in the South and quite conservative when I was first coming out. And I think this helped them in a way, and it also gave me a bit of a shield. It's very difficult for them to be like, you're gay and therefore you're lesser because of the especially in 2010 and even today, that our American society places on military service, and especially combat veterans. So the idea that I'm somehow lesser than they are in any way, I think was difficult to kind of put together in their head. And I'm not sure if my fellow panelists or others listening have had that experience, but I think it's very difficult. So I think it kind of gave me a bit of a shield that a lot of, gays, lesbians, and transgender people who are coming out probably don't have, honestly. I mean, I frankly think that gave me a lot of credibility with people who otherwise would have been far more skeptical.
It's funny, as you were talking, I was nodding my head because I've got 3 kids, high school, middle school, and elementary, and they are so much more comfortable and freer with the language and the understandings of gender and sexuality that we're all becoming more and more aware of in different ways, and having like research and science to explore on that in ways that growing up in the 70s and 80s or 90s, depending on your age, may not have been available to each one of us in different ways. And I was telling a story to my husband the other night, and I mentioned a friend's transgender son, and my high schooler from the other room goes, "Mom, why did you have to say transgender? He's their son." can't like give it up, like accept it. I'm like, yes, you're right, you know, but they're so much more comfortable with it. Not to say there isn't still work to do, but when I am around that generation, it is mind-blowingly awesome at times. And you know, to Justin's point as well about some of the broader benefits and what it gets us when we think differently about ourselves and embrace the kind of the individuality and the uniqueness of every single person. I don't know if any of you have read Sovereign Masculinity by Bonnie Mann. I don't normally do plugs for academic books. She wrote this in like 2014, but it explores masculinity and how it shapes the military, the U.S. military services and foreign policy. And it was really eye-opening for me to understand some of this, but she talks a lot about how it hurts all of us to not understand that and how it limits everyone in different ways. And I just heard echoes of that in what you were saying, and how understanding those different aspects, as you all have come to understand in your own lives through coming out and how that has felt. I wonder if you've observed some of the positive experiences on others that your coming out had. Y'all each talked about it kind of in little ways, but in the actual, like in the office, in uniform, in the service, not just in personal interactions. Have any of you had that happen, had kind of an experience along those lines that you can think of and want to share? Sorry, I added this one in kind of the last minute. It's not exactly, it was not in some of the ones we previously discussed, but just thinking about like how it changes not just us or you as leaders, but the people you work with and who then get to know you.
Well, I have one, and it's quite personal. It's my brother. So my brother has, you know, conservative guy, grown up in North Carolina, all of that. He literally cried in 2004 when I told him that I was gay, and I didn't find that out for a couple of years. His wife has always been quite, as it happens a lot of times in families, the male is a little bit more difficult, and being his brother, it was personal. But over the time, we've had 15 years of, especially, you know, I was in London 6 years, but since I've been back over the past year, we've gotten even closer. And interestingly enough, like he has his youngest child, he has 5 kids, and his youngest child is 9 or 10. And there's a lot of thinking that he might be transgender. So it's kind of interesting to have a gay brother, and he sounds me out about things. And obviously his wife and him are trying to deal with that. He's very open to, which is, I think maybe, hopefully, I paved the way a little bit for his kind of acceptance of the identity of his youngest son being maybe transgender. And I think he's too young at this point to realize what that might be, but there are a lot of indications that they're getting that at the very least he might be gay, and he might be transgender. So, but I think his openness to that possibility would probably not have been nearly as, and definitely the mini mental anguish probably would not have been nearly as high as it is, based on the fact, unless he had a gay brother. So, I mean, God or the universe or whatever you want to say, it works in mysterious ways, but I think that was one positive outcome, certainly, of, you know, coming out to other people that I had.
Thank you for that. And again, this next generation is proving to be so much better than us in so many different ways. So yeah, thank you. Emily or Sarah, do either of you have something to say? I think Sarah, you were muted earlier and I missed it, but.
Yeah, so for me, I wasn't able to come out during my service, but I had 2 instances that I remember very clearly that were, I think, very helpful for other people too. When Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed, one of my Marines, a female Marine, came in to my office, sits down and goes, "Hey, Gunny, I want you to know I'm bringing a girl that I want to marry to the ball." And while I couldn't come out, it was like, yes, it was this yes. And I'm like, and it looked right at her. I was like, and so who cares? You can do that, you know? And it was like, and I could see that giving her that reassurance, because honestly, that was her coming out to me, because I didn't know that for sure. I mean, I had thoughts about it, but I didn't know for sure. But that was a moment where she was coming out to me, and with who I was, it was an amazing moment. We've talked a couple after I came out, and she was like, "Wow, I did not know that about you." And I was like, "Well, nobody did." You know, I couldn't let people know that, but I was always there for you because I knew that. And she's like, you were accepting, you were amazing. And she even talked about me defeating biases within the shop. As she came out, I was right there to do it. So that coming out is an amazing thing. And we kind of, I think for us in the LGBTQ community, we help each other out along the way. And we show that support, and it's an amazing thing. The second one really quick was another female gunny. Really good friends with her, and my retirement's approved and all that. And I told her, I said, you wait till I retire. You're going to find out something you never knew about me. And she was like, yeah, right. I know everything about you. I'm like, no, you don't. And then after I retired and I came out, she's like, dang, I would have never have guessed that. But it really opened up a great conversation between us at that point, sharing the experience. And she's now doing ROTC work. And she has a non-binary ROTC student. So we've talked about that. So I think it's really helpful, and we touch each other in all those ways by our coming out and being our authentic selves.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And we have one more question, but I don't want to leave Emily out. Emily, did you want to answer the last one just now about positive influences elsewhere?
I think we covered it. I don't want to, I don't have good stories like that. I can't follow Sarah.
Well, and we lost Barb. I think she may have had to drop off. We're trying to figure out if she had a tech issue or not, just in case you're following along and wondering where she went. So hopefully we'll get her back on before the end, but I'll turn it over to Kai for the last one.
All right. So again, your personal experiences are really so important to understanding security writ large, right? Like what we think about with security, you're all a piece of that. So we want to end with your recommendation questions that are here. What are your recommendations to the national security decision makers? So I think you can think this DoD, you can think broad national security sector, because I think all of you've been involved in a variety of different aspects here. So if you could give them recommendations, what would they be? And Emily, we'll start with you since you
called myself out there, didn't I?
Yes.
I mean, I'll try to be really brief. I think for me, it comes down to talent. We need the best talent in the world. Talent comes in all shapes and sizes. I think for me too, when we talk about an inclusive fighting force, what I don't want is something that just pays lip service to it through talking points or performative type, training measures. I think the first thing, differentiate between diversity and inclusion. Diversity is measurable. You can look out in your ranks and you can see, oh, I've got this many women, I've got this many people of color, I've got this many LGBT service members. Inclusion is something else entirely, right? Inclusion is a feeling of belonging. And frankly, inclusion is where the true innovation happens. It's how you attract talent. It's how you get results. It's how you get participation. And for me, inclusion is all about leadership. And so I think, to really shape and foster inclusive leaders, there's HBR, there's Harvard Business School, research about this. For me, just a couple of the recommendations would be: one, create clear career paths for folks who look different to get to the top echelons of our service, right? I think we're slowly but surely doing this, but I still look around at the top brass and it's a bunch of, cis white men. I think we've got to do better there. I think two is encourage sponsorship, right? So sponsorship looks like, leaders who put their own reputations at risk and have real skin in the game to elevate the people that they work with, right? To elevate women, to elevate LGBT service members. And I don't think we see enough of that sponsorship happening. And I think the last thing is just like authenticity. We've already hit that point home, but if you've got an inclusive leader, you're going to feel safe coming to work being who you are. And I think we've all been in commands that are inclusive and in commands that are not. We all know the difference between them. And so I think just taking some of these really small steps, this is not an annual training that you do to check off the box. The leadership is really things that you do day in, day out, building it over time. So I hope we see more of that in the future.
Yeah, I mean, moving away from that box checking, I think is just, it is the next path forward. Justin, how about you? Any recommendations that you've got?
Felt like Emily has prepared that answer, so a little challenging to go after that. That was really well put. I think I'll focus slightly on both the civilian side and the military side, honestly, because I brought that in. I'm not certain, and I've worked for a variety of companies from a large Big Four consultancy, a large bank, smaller bank, IBM way back in the day. And I'm not sure, frankly, that a lot of the private side gets this answer correct either. There is a lot of diversity. There's a lot of acceptance. There's a lot of, you can be your full self at work. But as far as like mentoring people of color or LGBT individuals to the top of organizations, yeah, we see it. I mean, you've seen some, but I think that the diversity in the corporate, the S&P 500 and the boardrooms and in the top levels, echelons of the company, so 2 or 3 positions, is probably still overwhelmingly cis and white and heterosexual, honestly. So, I mean, how do you do better? I think one way, this inclusive attitude is obviously, and I like the way that was framed from Emily, diversity is one thing, inclusion is something else. I think the mentorship point is really good. I think the other thing is allowing, whether they're gay, straight, or transgender, or a person of color, I almost put this in a similar, I mean, Kai and I love dogs, and I'm not going to put it into dogs, but I always say there's never a bad dog. There's always just bad owners and trainers. And frankly, not to say that I'm a dog because I'm whatever, but I don't think there are bad employees or bad Marines necessarily. There's a few exceptions that we can all probably think of, especially Gunny over there. There aren't really bad Marines or bad service members. I think there's bad leadership, and you should be able to find innovative ways to work towards the strengths of what someone brings to the table. And I think that's a larger point, and I just don't think many organizations do it well. But, I've seen, for example, the CIA does something quite interesting where you can rise to the top of the analysis. So there's DI, which is their analysis side, and then there's operations, which is their operational side. And on the DI side, you don't have to manage people to necessarily rise to the top of the organization. I think that's a beautiful example of people who are really skilled and talented, but not necessarily good at managing people, who then have a path to rise to the top of the ranks and feel included in the organization and provide a lot of amazing insight. And to me, that's really innovative. I think they started that 20 or 30 years ago, where you can actually, go to the strengths of someone, but not require them to do something that many people just either don't want to do or are not very good at doing. And I think thinking outside of the box in that way, and I'm not sure how it would work in the military, obviously with a hierarchical organization. I think we kind of have it with maybe chief warrant officers a little bit, where you can become a specialist and rise pretty high. But again, yeah, I think those are, and the inclusion thing is risk taking. I mean, I think we've seen, I don't know what everyone else thinks. I won't get into Afghanistan, but I think there is a element, at least, some of the junior officers I served with and senior non-commissioned officers I served with were the best managers and leaders in the world. They felt staff sergeants, gunnies, and master sergeants and first sergeants. And then of course, lieutenants, especially captain or 03s to 05s, they feel a real, especially if they're not looking to get a star or looking to become sergeant major, I think, they feel a real opportunity to take risks with how they manage and lead people, how they get an organization to do well while increasing its morale, all of these things. And I think that risk-taking element is off the table sometimes for our senior ranks. Somehow, it seems to me, the ability to speak truth to power and say, obviously respectfully while getting the mission done, how you think about things, encouraging that attitude of open engagement. And I think we see this in a lot of organizations where the risk-taking factor goes away. And with that, you just lose a lot of innovation and dynamism. That's why small businesses, to me, are some of the most innovative things out there, because it's 10, 15 people and they've got this culture that's great. And I'm not sure we can do it for large bureaucracies, but man, I hope we can figure it out, because that's going to really, I think, would change a lot of things if we were able to work to people's strengths, allow people to be more risk-taking and truth-talking to different, leadership or oversight of the organizations in the military. So those are a couple of my views.
All right. And Sarah, we will round it out with you and your recommendations.
So I think on, defense and decision and policy making, one of the things that we need to focus on, because we're a volunteer military, and the defense of our nation is done by volunteers. If we don't change the policies to become more inclusive, while the society and the general public is, you're not going to get the recruits from them. And then there's another part that I think plays out too, is you could take like me, for example, your recruiting population also comes from parents that served. I have 6 children, and I question now, how could I let them join under the current biases and stereotypes and all that? 4 of my children are girls. And with that, my personal knowledge of those biases and all that, and it's not just the biases. We have the military sexual trauma. We have all that stuff out there. How can I let my children join? If we want to keep a secure nation, we got to keep our volunteer military force. And I think in that, we have to become inclusive. The leaders have to become inclusive. And as a project manager that I was, if I'm not inclusive, I'm leaving some of my workforce out. I'm not getting full production. And sometimes I think we got to break it down to those nuts and bolts like that to be able to create that inclusivity. It's like when you break it down to these leaders, to these managers, if you're not inclusive, that means you're excluding some of your manpower and you're not getting full production. I think sometimes we got to switch the way we're looking at what inclusivity is and how to get it moving. The other part too, I want to say is create the inclusive infrastructure. Create it first, then advertise it. There's nothing worse than saying we are an inclusive organization, and then you get there and the benefit packages don't match. The culture doesn't match. You need to build that first, because once you build that and it's known that's there at your organization or wherever else, I go to you build it, they will come. You will get the best and brightest. And so I think we got to kind of shift to that way. There's another thing I want to say for decision making and policy. I call it the American exception rule. You know, we can look and do case studies on all these other nations and organizations that have done it in other countries. But what happens is we go, it won't work here. Well, why won't it work? Because we're America. We're different. And we don't, and it's a mentality that we got to change too in our policy, defense, and even in our organizations, to think that just because we're Americans doesn't mean something in another country wouldn't work for us. I mean, we have our differences, we have our nuances, but we can use that, equate them out of what they're doing in another country. So that's really, I mean, there's so much and like there's starting points I think we need to go to, but there's so much more that could be done.
Thank you. And Kai and I both want to come on briefly. I know we're at the end of our time, but you all have been amazing and incredibly generous with your time and your stories. And this has been the most fun, also in some ways heartbreaking, but fun and invigorating panel that we have had in a long time. So thank you all for your honesty and your willingness to dig in, and to the audience and to CNAS and MVS for your support.
Yeah, and thank you, Kai and Jeanette, and all of our panelists and all of our audience members. We really appreciate you having this conversation. I think, you know, again, putting the human side of policy implications out there is really important, not only for currently serving service members and senior leaders, but also policymakers and lawmakers. And I think that each of you provided a perspective that I think is also encouraging to those who are currently serving. So we thank you all for joining in today. You can continue to follow along on the conversation on the CNAS Twitter handle, CNASDC, and we hope to keep this conversation going as we think about how the services can best access the talent that's out there. So thank you to everyone.